Hello, welcome back to Dinosaurs. We're going to keep walking through Module 2 here. We talked about functional morphology last time, how we can kind of study how dinosaurs work based on some of the shapes in the hard parts that are preserved, and kind of reconstructing, and in some cases even actually building dinosaur models or simulating dinosaur models. Today we're going to talk about trace fossils, which are kind of fossilized behavior, such as the trackways behind me here. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We'll get into some more nesting and social behaviors on Friday. We'll talk about how dinosaurs are built and whether they were ectothermic or endothermic or maybe mesothermic. And then it's going to be midterm time next Friday. So I'm going to post up study topics probably tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. Before we get into the lecture today, though, some announcements. So, okay, so let's review. So going back to functional morphology, one of the examples that we used was Tyrannosaurus rex's bite force. So there are no living Tyrannosaurus rex. There are no living non-bird dinosaurs to go study their bite force. How could we possibly know how strong T-Rex's bite was? So how could we study the bite force of an extinct animal? So take a look at the options there and think about what we might be able to do to get a good estimate of the bite force. 3, 2, 1, 0. So I would say that any of the first three, so it's kind of a trick question, any of the first three would work. So you could build a physical model. You could actually take a T-Rex skull, mount it onto some kind of machine to actually crunch down and just see what the jaw was capable of before it would break. So there is a limit to the strength that it possibly could be. So you could actually build a physical working chomping T-Rex jaw or something like it. You could create it in a computer simulation and simulate it, build up the musculature and simulate the bite force in a computer program. Or you can study modern analogs. So you could look at, for example, crocodiles. Crocodiles are fairly close relatives of dinosaurs. We walked through the Archosaur tree before, so they're on the crocodilomorph tree, which branched off with the Rauisuchians and those others. But they're pretty close, and so you could study the modern analogs like crocodiles and alligators to kind of try to get to T-Rex bite force. Wild guessing is a wrong answer, so wild guessing is never going to be the right answer to any of these questions. If you see wild guessing, don't choose it. Nothing in science is wild guessing. Some estimates are better than others, but we're never just guessing. So let's talk about trace fossils. So before we talk about trace fossils, we need to discriminate between body fossils and trace fossils. So when you think of a fossil, you probably think of body fossils. So body fossils are the preserved remains of the actual organism itself. So this is an example of a body fossil here. This is a hadrosaur skeleton. The hard bones are preserved. In some cases, teeth are preserved. Shells, things like that. Those are body fossils. Those are actual pieces of the organism that are preserved. Trace fossils are fossilized evidence of an organism's presence or their behavior. So they're traces that the organism was there, but they're not the actual organism itself. So things like tracks, like these dinosaur prints behind me, burrows, even feces, lots of different things count as trace fossils, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, we have a fossil. Is it a body fossil? Well, is the skeleton, can it be unaltered remains, permineralization, replacement, molds and casts, carbonization? We talked about all these earlier on. Or is it a trace fossil, things like tracks, borings, burrows, and coprolites? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Here's a very large dinosaur footprint here with a person there for scale. This is in Western Australia. This is a sauropod footprint, and you see just how big these things are. And we can learn things from the size of the footprint, the depth of the footprint, the width of the footprint, the spacing between the footprints. That's what we're going to talk about today. So trace fossils. Trace fossils, sometimes you'll see them referred to as ichnofossils. So it's the same thing, ichnofossil, trace fossil, same thing. They're sedimentary structures, so they're structures in sedimentary rocks, like sandstone or mudstone or siltstone, that are left by the organisms. So these dinosaur footprints here are in sandstone. a dinosaur stepped on the sand when it was still sand and left an imprint, and then this rock was lithified into hard rock. So these dinosaurs are not stepping on hard rock and leaving impressions. They're stepping on the sediment while it's still soft, and then it becomes rock later on and preserves that footprint. But trace fossils, again, are things like tracks, trails, burrows, borings, coprolites, which again are fossilized feces, and they represent evidence of their lifestyle. They reference things like behavior, things that we often don't get to see if we're only looking at the hard parts. So we're all pretty familiar with this general concept, and forensic scientists actually use things like this a lot too. But if you're out walking in the woods, you can use modern tracks to try to figure out what kind of critters are around. And you see that different animals have different trails. Some of them are bipedal, most of them are quadrupedal. You can see some of them have a tail drag mark. Some of them, the hind limbs and forelimbs are different. Some of them, they're very similar. Some of them are hooved like deer, and some of them have claws and some don't. So you can tell them apart by knowing those properties. This is kind of a really cool example of a trace fossil where we can actually kind of tell a story with it. They're hippity hoppity bunny tracks, boing, 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 boing. And then the bunny trail ends and something got him. So either an owl or a hawk swooped down. And so from these tracks, from just these traces, neither one of these organisms is present anymore. We can put together a story of what happened. If you remember My Cousin Vinny, they learned a lot about that crime from the tire tracks. You can see here these tire tracks cut across each other, and you can actually see that like this set of tire tracks is younger. It came after this set of tire tracks, and you can kind of start piecing this together. Or a lot of times forensic scientists will use shoe prints. So shoe prints are traced to individual types of shoes, or shoe prints can be overlaid with each other to get a sense of timing, who was walking where, when, and why. Well, maybe not why, you have to infer that part, but you can see evidence preserved in just these prints, just these traces, without the organism itself being present anymore. So some advantages of trace fossils over body fossils. Again, we're very familiar with body fossils, and we've been talking a lot about what we can know from body fossils, but in many ways, trace fossils can be more information and more advantageous. So one thing is that their preservation, while maybe not more likely, they're often preserved in rocks that don't have body fossils. So for example, beaches, the wave action tends to destroy and disarticulate skeletons, transport them elsewhere, whereas a footprint would maybe be more likely to be preserved. Or also like all the taphonomic effects that we talked about earlier. So like when a dinosaur dies, if its body isn't quickly buried, it can be scavenged, it can be washed away, the soft parts rot, and the hard parts can be kind of moved around. Some kind of scavenger might cart off with pieces of it. There's a lot of things that can happen to a skeleton, a body after it dies, but most of these things don't impact traces. Scavengers aren't going to eat footprints. They're not going to eat coprolites in most cases. So in many ways, in certain environments, they're more likely to be preserved than the body fossils. And the other thing is that a dinosaur could die in one place and be swept downstream to an entirely different location, or even the old bloat and float, where the dinosaur carcass bloats, floats out onto a lake or floats out in an ocean and eventually settles in bottom in a very different environment from where it lived, and that could lead to different interpretations that would be wrong. Trace fossils stay where they are. A footprint gets made in the mud along a riverbank. That footprint's not going to go anywhere. It's going to stay there if it's preserved in the rock record. So there's a couple advantages over body fossils. Some disadvantages is that footprints are really good indicators of behavior. It's often our only glimpses into behavior. Coprolites provide really good insights into diet and behavior, but they're rarely found with their makers. So like this is an example here of a theropod dinosaur making theropod footprints. and a sauropod dinosaur making sauropod, or sorry, that's an ornithischian dinosaur making ornithischian footprints, hadrosaur. If we only see the tracks, we're not sure exactly which theropod dinosaur left those tracks. We're not sure exactly which ornithischian dinosaur left those tracks. In some cases, we can kind of narrow it down. Like, for example, T-Rex is a really large theropod dinosaur. There's not many candidates for really large theropod footprints, but a more modest footprint, there could be many different candidates for that footprint. And it's very rare that you see the actual body of the organism. So it would be very kind of coincidental that at the end of a long trackway of footprints that happened to be preserved, the organism just kind of keeled over and died and then was preserved. That's very unlikely. So it's really cool information about how that dinosaur is moving, but it's pretty tough to tell in some cases what dinosaur it actually was, which dinosaur was that left those prints. Same thing if we find a coprolite leaving, we find the feces, we find the fossil coprolite feces, we're able to analyze it. We can look at what's in there. We can see if there's like plant fragments that it might be an herbivore, or crushed up bone fragments that it might be a carnivore. We can tell things about how it digests, but it might be very difficult to figure out exactly which dinosaur left that behind. Again, like if you have a very large carnivorous droppings, it might narrow it down to a few or even one species, but in most cases it's kind of ambiguous as to where it actually came from and who was the coprolite scientists like to say the poopetrator who left it, who dealt it. So these are some disadvantages. While we might be able to get a lot of information on whichever dinosaur left the trace, we might not know which dinosaur that was. So let's take a look at trackways first. So these movement traces, they can provide really valuable information on speed, on gait, how the animal is walking, on weight, so body mass. Again, when we're looking at just the skeletal remains, there's a little bit of uncertainty as to how muscled the organism was, how much fat was on the organism, how much air was in the body cavity, how much it was empty space. The actual body mass is fairly difficult to reliably reconstruct from just the hard parts. So having impressions in the sediment can really give us some information about how the organism was built when it still had all of its soft parts that were usually missing. We can also tell about the width of the animal. Some behaviors are evident from trackways. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And maybe even migration, where the animals went. So this is a trackway here. You see this is probably a meter stick for scale. Just these massive footprints. These are sauropod footprints, some kind of very large herbivorous sauropod dinosaur. Which one? We don't necessarily know that, unfortunately, but we can see that obviously that it was very large, massive, and we can tell from how deep the footprints are, how big it was, how massive it was, how much it weighed, because we can kind of estimate the compressibility of the sediment and how much it would squish under a given load, and we can kind of back calculate out how big that dinosaur would be. We also see that there's kind of an angle between each of these steps. There's a stride length, how much the leg moves forward on each step. In some cases, we can see that there are different impressions for the hands, the front limbs, and the feet, the back limbs, the pes and the manus. So we can tell that, okay, well, this dinosaur was a quadruped. It was walking on all fours, versus we see only two sets of prints that are the same. Then that's a bipedal organism. So we can tell quadrupedal versus bipedal. And some dinosaurs would kind of freely kind of switch back and forth between these depending on the situation, but they're kind of dominantly one or the other. But there's a lot of different things we can tell about the diameter, the geometry of these tracks. And so we can see here, this is a reconstruction here, kind of a cartoon of a bunch of different dinosaur tracks. And you see not only that there's multiple different trackways here, there's also multiple different dinosaurs represented. So there's some theropod footprints, there's some sauropod footprints, There's different sizes mixed in here, which gives us some insights into dinosaur society, how they lived together and how they interacted with each other. And so these tracks are really, really irreplaceable information. This is Dinosaur Ridge, very famous location with the footprints. They actually go through and they put charcoal in the footprint traces to kind of make them pop out a little bit so that black coloration isn't real. It doesn't harm the footprint in any way, it just kind of makes them pop a little bit more so people can see them. This is the same trackway in the picture behind me. It's probably flipped for you. Yeah, so much information can be derived from these trackways here. So let's talk about the different types of tracks. So dinosaur tracks can be preserved in 3 different ways. So the most obvious one is the true track. The dinosaur steps in the mud or steps in the sand and it leaves an imprint. That's the actual impression of the foot in the soft sediment. And this gives us all kinds of insights, again, into the how fast that thing was moving, how long its stride was, how tall it was, how wide it was. It can also even give us insight into the soft parts of the foot. So we see preserved the skeleton of the foot, but were there like foot pads? So for example, like a cat's paw, the toe beans are unlikely. Oh, as soon as I say cat, the cat meows. Those would be unlikely to be preserved, and so we wouldn't maybe know that that existed. The natural cast is, so we've got this true track here, this negative depression, this indent in the sediment where the foot was. Sediment can fill that hole in, and then so on the bottom of the bed above, you'll have a cast, a positive feature that kind of filled in that trait. And so you can see one here. This is the bottom of a bed and we're kind of looking up at it. Was this dinosaur walking on the ceiling, walking upside down on the bottom of this bed? No, this filled in to the hole below and that bed is now gone. And the last kind are the under tracks. So some dinosaurs were so massive, particularly the sauropod dinosaurs, that whenever they stepped, they would actually squish the sediment that's even in the deeper layers. So you see here, there's a bunch of layers of rock. This layer is mostly undisturbed. This layer here, though, that's where the dinosaur was actually stepping. And you see it smushed down in, and it's even deformed these lower layers below it. That's the under track. And so it takes like really massive dinosaurs to make that. But so not all tracks have an under track, but that can happen. So you can get 3 different kinds: the true track, the actual foot itself, the natural cast filling in that cavity and being on the underside of the bed, and the under track kind of squishing through to the bed below. Another thing that's very informative about tracks is that obviously different dinosaurs leave different tracks. So showed that figure about all the different footprints that you might find in the woods. Different woodland critters leave different tracks because they're built differently and they behave differently. Different dinosaurs leave different tracks because they're built differently and they behave differently. All these little scale bars here, those are 50 centimeters. They're all the same. So you see that, you know, this foot here, this massive sauropod, this is about a 1 meter long foot, about 3 feet. So that's pretty big. You can see the width too. You can also see that the back feet are very different from the front feet, and we see that from the skeletal evidence as well. Here's a kind of a different dinosaur here. You see the kind of larger back foot impressions. You can see at times the entire back foot is on the sediment, and at times it's kind of more toe walking. You see kind of a sweep here that might be like a toe drag, or it might be an example of tail drag. One thing that we see or I should say we rarely see with dinosaurs is tail drag is very much not present. It's very rare to see tail drag marks. So the original idea that dinosaurs were kind of slow plodding reptiles, kind of like an alligator or a crocodile, kind of low to the ground, just kind of skulking and plodding along with the tail kind of dragging behind on the ground. That's not what they were like. Very much usually more active stances with the tail raised up in the air, a very heavily muscled tail, usually kind of as a counterbalance to keep the weight over the hips. You see this dinosaur was kind of moving along bipedally, and then it decided that it wanted to go down on 4 feet, maybe to kind of like just chill out for a little bit or something. You see here, here's a bipedal stance of a dinosaur, or a quadrupedal stance of this dinosaur, and a different one that could be more upright. You see the standard like 3 toes for the ornithischians and the theropods versus the 4 or I think sometimes 5 toes for sauropods. You also see that some of them have claws and some of them do not. The meat-eating carnivores, the theropod carnivorous dinosaurs, they have sharp claws at the end of their 3 toes, and the ornithischians don't, because they're, again, almost exclusively herbivores. So we can tell a lot about a dinosaur from just looking at its feet, just looking at its tracks. We can tell kind of its stance, whether it's 4 feet or 2 feet, whether it's dragging its tail on the ground, in some cases even whether it's a herbivore or a carnivore, just based on the feet. So what can we look at in trackways? So if multiple tracks are present, it's called a trackway. So this is a trackway, whereas an individual footprint is a track. Again, if we measure certain properties, we get a lot of information. So here's that figure that we saw before. If we know like stride length, that relates to the height of the organism, or at least the length of the leg. And if we know the distance they're apart, that tells us kind of how wide the organism is. If we look at the patterns at which they fall, that can tell us some things. These are for modern organisms. So like a pacer is kind of like the diagonal front, back, front, back. There's diagonal walker where the hind limb tends to fall in the footprint of the front limb. Cats actually do this. I think it's called a registered stance, where they'll actually their back foot will step on the footprint of the front foot, and they do this to kind of avoid being tracked by predators, and also to kind of be a little bit more stealthy, and they're only leaving half of the footprints because they very much try to step in. There's this cool video of a cat walking on sand, and you see that it only makes 2 footprints because they're so good at the footfalls in the same print. There's bounding tracks here where the front limbs kind of come down first, the back limbs then they leap and they kind of do this kind of thing. And you see the front limbs are landing first and the back limbs behind it, and then they bound again. And then there's the gallopers where the back legs actually come down in front of the front limbs under speed. So you can tell a lot from the geometry of the track that tells you kind of how they're walking, kind of, and also like the speed. So how fast are they moving? You can also tell by kind of like the indent, like is it just the toes? That might mean that the animal is kind of running. If you see more of the foot impressed in there, that means that it's probably kind of moving along fairly slow. So let's talk about speed. A lot of people in the chat have been interested in how fast dinosaurs move. There's a fairly direct relationship between leg length, so how long the leg is from the hip, stride length, how long each step is with an individual leg, and speed. So they're pretty well related to each other. And so if we can measure the leg length from a body fossil, and we can measure the stride length from a trace fossil, we can calculate speed. Now, obviously, there's going to be some error on this, and it is an estimate, and there's certain caveats here, but it's a good estimate probably. So there was always this question of like, are dinosaurs these plodding, slow, cold-blooded, quote-unquote lizards? So thunder, the dinosaur, remember, like terrifying lizard. They're not lizards, they're type of reptile, but they kind of had that reputation of they're slow movers, but really the pendulum kind of swinging to that they're kind of like more active, maybe even as active as birds, which are hyperactive with super fast metabolisms, or are some dinosaurs a little bit of both? And that's probably more likely, where certain species are more fast moving and more high metabolism, more high strung, and certain others are less, but certainly not like the cold-blooded, lazy, plodding lizards. But here, if we're able to get a stride length, this is kind of the function for relationship. It's a little, this is the actual formula that takes stride length and leg length. This is only stride length. If you know the stride length from the trackway, you can roughly compute a speed. And so this graphic here, could you outrun a T-Rex? So that's a pretty common question, right? If you imagine yourself transported back into the Mesozoic, one of the things that we would be afraid of is we would be on the menu. So there's a lot of critters in the Mesozoic that would be actively hunting us. We would be a nice delicious snack for a Tyrannosaurus Rex. So if it was going to chase us, could we get away? The simple answer is no, probably not. So Homo sapiens humans, they run, and this is kind of more towards the top speed. I'm pretty sure I can't get to 8 meters per second, but maybe. I don't know, maybe in my younger days. But 8 meters per second is kind of like a top kind of speed for a human. Tyrannosaurus is pretty close to that, a little bit faster. But we're about evenly matched. So like incredibly fast humans might be able to get away. So like Usain Bolt might be able to outrun the T-Rex, but it would be a close match. Allosaurs are a little bit faster. Things like Dilophosaurus, you start seeing that they're a little bit more, a little smaller, a little bit slender, a little bit more built for speed and less for power. These things can move quite fast. Velociraptor, quite a bit faster. And then some of the more like these bird-footed orthomimids and things like that, they can be very fast. So like, how does that compare? So this is maybe the fastest dinosaur at about 18 meters per second. The ostriches are kind of in that ballpark. Ostriches are run at about 20 meters per second max. Pronghorns are very quick. They can get up to about 27 meters per second. And cheetahs can get very quick bursts of 30 meters per second. So a cheetah is about, 4-ish times faster than a T-Rex. But there are some features on a cheetah that allows it to run quickly, like that kind of flexible, slinky spine. And we're aware of that because we can actually see it working in the modern animal. There may in fact be adaptations like that that are present in some dinosaurs that we may not be really giving them credit for because it's not immediately obvious from just their hard parts. So that's again why looking at trackways is so important. But T-Rex is pretty fast. It's not the slow plodding dinosaur, and again, not sure where the like motion-based vision came from thing, but there's very little you could do if a T-Rex was coming at you. It can see you very well. They're very visual creatures. It can smell you very well. They're very smell-oriented, and it can run very well. And it's not going to have any problem dispatching you if it catches you. So what else can we learn from the trackways? So one big question is, if you look at the herbivorous dinosaurs, did the herbivore dinosaurs travel in herds? So a lot of modern herbivores travel around in herds. So this is a wildebeest herd in the Serengeti in Africa. Massive herds, a lot of other organisms, a lot of other modern animals cluster in herds. So like bison, elk, they get together in herds. So what was a dinosaur's social life like? Did dinosaurs live in herds? So think about a herd. Think about how you could identify a herd from trackways. So if you just see a bunch of dinosaur prints, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a herd. It could be multiple individuals that just happen to come through at very different times. So these dinosaur footprints behind me here, it's possible they were all made very close in time together with each other. It's also entirely possible that one track is years older than another, and they just kind of got left behind, and you might even see cross-cutting on that. So how could you identify a herd where they're actually kind of moving together? Well, if you look at this cartoon here, one good indicator is that they're all kind of going the same-ish direction. So if you see a bunch of dinosaur trackways and they're all sort of in the same-ish direction, now obviously the herd kind of moves around a little bit, organisms move every which way, but they kind of have a dominant direction that they're headed. That would be like a telltale for a herd. Another thing is that inside of a herd, all of the organisms are moving together. So a herd would have adults, a herd would have juveniles, a herd would probably have babies depending on the time of year. And so there was a study done on a large series of hadrosaur trackways, and the question was, is this a herd? And one thing they plotted out for every individual footprint, they measured the width and the length. And so obviously as the dinosaurs get older and get larger, their feet get wider and their feet get longer, and there's a set ratio. It's a nice line here, so that ratio doesn't really change with time, but the absolute values do. And so looking at all of the different tracks that were there, there was a cluster of a lot of smaller hadrosaurs, not so much in the middle stages, and then sort of more adults. And again, sexual dimorphism can be a thing. So in a lot of species, the males are bigger than the females. In some species, it's the other way around. So we might have kind of juveniles here. This might be the difference between male and females. Which one's which, we don't necessarily know, but this might be a sexual dimorphism here at the top for adults, or it just might be that certain ones get bigger than others. But the fact that there's a lot of different hadrosaurs of various life stages all kind of hanging out together and moving in generally the same direction, that's pretty good evidence for herding behavior. And as we find more examples of these trackways, as we find more evidence of, again, fossilized dinosaur behavior, these things will become a little bit more concrete. And did sauropods travel in herds? So that these hadrosaurs seem to have. Did the large sauropod dinosaurs do that? Did theropods travel together? So we'll talk about that a little bit. But in the modern animals, the herds go places, they migrate. So like, again, the wildebeest that we saw on the last slide, the wildebeests kind of move around the Serengeti throughout the year. They kind of move with the seasons, and they're also moving around so that they're not like eating all of the vegetation in one location. The herd keeps kind of moving along to give the environment a little time to like rebound. If you just stay in one area and you eat all the grass that's there, you're not going to be very successful. So they keep kind of moving. We see this behavior with bison, we see this behavior with caribou, we see this behavior with a lot of different large herbivorous modern animals. And so did the large herbivorous ancient animals do this too? So like, again, did the sauropod dinosaurs migrate? Well, how could you tell? So again, migration would be herds. The herd would be all kind of going in the same direction, and that direction would kind of be like maybe seasonal. So this is Switzerland, the modern day Alps here, forming a topographic barrier. And so one thing that's sort of interesting is that these dinosaur trackways that are marked here in orange, you can see that they're elongate, they're linear, 1 kilometer. So these are multiple kilometer long trackways that are found. And then there's kind of gaps in between them, but they're all kind of pointed in roughly the same direction. And they're all sort of along this highland that would have been a high all the way back into the Mesozoic. So this is kind of evidence of like tectonics and mountain building, mountain chain topography, the landscape really kind of funneling the dinosaurs. And we see very similar things with modern animals. They're not going to cross the mountains, they'll parallel with the mountains. In some cases they will, but topographic barriers, animals moving around them, responding to them. And this really does have the pattern that we might expect from a migration, where we have this long linear path of multiple individuals heading in the same direction. So maybe they did. Certain dinosaurs probably were in herds, and certain of those herds probably migrated. Which ones, we'll talk a little bit more later, but not a lot of evidence for that, but I'm getting more all the time. So along with herds comes stalking. So a lot of, as these wildebeests move around, the large carnivores that are preying on them move around too. So they're stalked along the way by modern large carnivorous animals. So as dinosaur herds were moving, if dinosaur herds were moving, but it seems likely, at least in some cases. So as these dinosaur herds are moving, were they being hunted? Were they actively being hunted? So like, again, here's a zebra herd, and you can see that they're kind of together in a group, and you can see the large carnivores here sitting off on the periphery of the herd. They're off on the side of the herd. They're not actively engaged with hunting in these zebras. They're not charging at the zebra herd. Charging headlong into a herd is a pretty poor strategy. So these lions are kind of waiting on the fringes, kind of looking for an opportunity. Oftentimes they'll try to single out smaller individuals or sicker individuals, or they'll try to get the herd kind of running a little bit and try to single out one or two individuals to kind of separate off from the herd. That's where that cliche comes from. So that's kind of how lions behave. We see wolves doing similar things, hyenas doing similar things. A lot of active carnivorous predators behave very similarly with the herd. It's not a good idea to confront the herd. Zebras are kind of cool looking and they look cute and they're very interesting animals. Their hooves hurt. If you've never been kicked by a horse, it is not a fun experience. Even just getting stepped on by a horse is not a fun experience. Horses are pretty damn dangerous. Wildebeests, water buffalo, these are dangerous animals. Taking on an entire herd of them, even for something as dangerous as a lion, is very taxing and very dangerous, and they do it strategically. And so they stay on the periphery until opportunity strikes. Did dinosaurs do that? Well, here is a bunch of trackways of a lot of sauropod dinosaurs. There's some more inefficient dinosaurs mixed in, generally moving in one direction. So again, this looks like a herd. This looks like the herd may be migrating, maybe all moving in the same direction. So there's a herbivorous herd of dinosaurs here. And then along the periphery, highlighted in black here, there are theropod dinosaur tracks. And these are primarily carnivorous dinosaurs, things like, so T-Rex is a theropod, velociraptors are theropods. These carnivorous dinosaurs, the footprints are not intermingled with the pack, but you see them kind of out, or not intermingled with the herd, but you see them kind of off on the fringes. Maybe fossilized behavior here of dinosaurs kind of hunting these herds with very similar strategies to modern animals, kind of picking off at the fringes, at the margins, trying to take on one or two at a time instead of the entire group. So that leads to, like, did dinosaurs hunt in packs? So again, many modern carnivores hunt in small groups, so like wolf packs, lion prides, and what you see is as they're hunting, they're actively coordinating their efforts. They're trying to kind of like divide and conquer, and they're trying to take down large prey that would not be possible if they were acting as individuals. So carnivorous dinosaurs are scary enough to think about on their own. So you think about one T-Rex, again, they run just as fast as we do, a little bit faster. They have really acute vision, really acute smell. It's going to be difficult to get away from that thing, and they're apex predators. They're scary as individuals. Now imagine them coordinating with each other and dividing and conquering. That's a scary thought. No, there's not a ton of evidence for things like T-Rex working in packs, but there are traces of T-Rex in groups, small groups of like 2 to 3 individuals. Now, there is no evidence of them coordinating together to hunt like this. So what would this look like? So how would you tell? Well, one way that some people have started to try to study this is in a lion pride, for example, when the lion pride makes a kill, all of the animals eat it. And so like the adults that did the hunting in the pride and the young that didn't, the cubs that didn't, they're still eating the same food because the pack, the pride, they're working together as a group. So like Jurassic Park made the idea that velociraptors hunt in packs and coordinate, and they're very clever. Is that really what we see? So if we look at velociraptor groups, it appears that the young and the adults are eating different things. And so that's kind of evidence that maybe points away from a pack behavior. If the adults are hunting what they can, and the young adults, the juveniles, are hunting something different that they're capable of taking down on their own, it kind of argues against that they're working together. But so a dinosaur, Deinonychus, which is very closely related to velociraptors, they have evidence of some pack behavior where multiple individuals are found within the same bed as though they had died together, and their trackways seem to be kind of coordinated. and they're kind of walking with two claws with that big killing claw kind of up in the air. Maybe these are pack behaviors, but again, it's sort of hard to tell. Certainly, these carnivorous dinosaurs were stalking these herds. Whether they were kind of more solo or whether they were coordinating, that's a little trickier. There's a lot of argument in the literature, kind of it goes back and forth on this. And it may be that some did and some didn't, just like modern carnivores. Some modern carnivores act solo and some act in groups. And it's probably true about dinosaurs as well. Another thing that we see is burrowing. So we don't often think of dinosaurs burrowing. Again, we think of dinosaurs as like these massive juggernauts that are just wandering around out in open, no reason to hide. Remember that a lot of dinosaurs were actually pretty small. Not a lot of medium dinosaurs, which is interesting. We'll talk about that later. But this is a fossil that was found of Chengmiana Leonengensis. Probably butchered that, but it translates roughly to eternal sleep. It was found in what looks like a sleeping position. So like if you think about like a dog or a cat, this is a very common sleeping position. And it's also incredibly well preserved. So the entire skeleton is here. It's all still fully articulated. It looks like it was very quickly buried in this sleeping position. And it looks like it was in a burrow protected when it died. Also, if you look at the structure of it, it shows a lot of adaptations for digging. So it has this pointy kind of shovel nose, really stout clawed limbs, muscular shoulders for digging. So this dinosaur probably did burrow. There's some evidence of like the Lystrosaurs, the early synapsids burrowing. Might be one reason why they made it through the Permian mass extinction. But there's all these in some Mesozoic beds and Mesozoic rocks. There's these kind of weird structures that nobody really knew what to make of them. And it just looks like a hole that was infilled with sediment. And like, so geologic processes to do this are fairly limited, but biologic processes that do this are fairly common. So think of all of the different burrowing organisms that you can think of. So these weird features are probably dinosaur burrows. And you have to be kind of fortunate to find the organism associated with the burrow to be able to figure it out. But a lot of modern animals burrow, a lot of recently extinct animals burrowed. Dinosaurs probably burrowed too, or at least the smaller ones probably burrowed too. And the last type of fossil, trace fossil that we're going to talk about are coprolites. So again, coprolites are fossilized feces. It preserves evidence of their diet and it preserves evidence of behavior. So if you look at a piece of dinosaur poop, and if you watch some of the videos on the YouTube playlist, no, it doesn't stink. So they've been dried out for at least 66 million years. And they've also been fully, completely replaced by rock. So it's not actually poop anymore. It's been replaced. But if you look at the undigested fragments, if you perform chemical analysis, you can actually kind of narrow down to what they were eating. Grasses, so grasses are not around in the Mesozoic, but different plants have different chemical signatures. And so you can figure out what the dinosaur is eating by looking at those chemical signatures. And then the carnivorous dinosaurs, you can tell kind of what dinosaurs they were eating by those signatures. It can also provide some insights on their teeth. So why would we care? So remember that the coprolites are left behind and we may not know what dinosaur made them. So if you look at what's in the leavings, you might be able to kind of piece together what kind of teeth the dinosaur had. And then you might be able to narrow down your list of suspects. And they also provide some information on the efficiency of the digestion. So normally at the end of the day, we have the skeleton. We don't have the stomach. We don't have the intestines. We don't have the gizzard. We don't have the soft parts. We don't have the internal organs. What did a dinosaur's digestive tract look like? How efficient was it? So like cows have a very different digestive tract than like say lions. Carnivorous dinosaurs and herbivorous dinosaurs had very different digestive tracts. What did they look like? How efficient were they? Looking at the leavings can help us out with that. Here's this scientist here is devoted her entire career to examining all of these different coprolites and making insights into what left them and what it tells us about the Mesozoic environment and what it tells us about the everyday lives of whoever it was that left these traces behind. Let's take a look at the largest coprolite ever found. So it's actually got a name. So this is a large piece of dinosaur poop. It's 20 pounds. It's been fully lithified, 26.5 inches long, and it's 6 inches diameter. So this is a very large leaving. It's so large, it's the world record holder. It's got a name, it's Barnum. It's on display at the Museum. So this is a museum dedicated to displaying coprolites. I actually put a link here. If you want to go to the website, you can check it out. It's pretty interesting. It's definitely weird, but it's interesting. There's been CT scans done of Barnum that shows that there's a lot of bone fragments in there, and X-ray fluorescence to get to the chemistry shows that there's elevated levels of calcium and phosphate. These are the things that bones are made out of. And so this is leaving of some very large carnivorous dinosaur. So again, which one? Well, we didn't find the dinosaur with the pile, so we can only guess, but T-Rex is the only Hell Creek dinosaur. So Hell Creek is the formation. We'll talk about Hell Creek at the end of the class. Hell Creek is the T-Rex is the only dinosaur around that was big enough and carnivorous to leave something like this. So this is a T-Rex coprolite. You can see here again, biting force. I think the numbers are a little bit different from the graph I showed last time. Why? Because they made the estimate in a different way. Again, there's error around all this stuff. This makes the bite force pretty close to that of an alligator, whereas on the other one it was a little bit higher. Still the highest. But yeah, T-Rex, from looking at the leavings, you can make inferences about its diet. And then the last thing is, so gastroliths, gastro stomach, lith is rock, so stomach rocks, stomach stones. They're rocks that dinosaurs ingested. So they literally swallowed rocks into their guts, and it helps them to aid in digestion. So a lot of herbivorous birds, modern birds do this. So ostriches do this. Some waterfowl do this. Crocodiles and alligators and some frogs do it too. But in many cases, the crocodiles and alligators are not herbivores, so they're not using them to grind plants. In this case, they're using it to regulate probably their buoyancy. So if you're too floaty and you want to dive, if you eat a couple rocks, it makes you sink. So like scuba divers will wear like weight belts. It's a kind of similar concept. Here's an axolotl that's been kind of x-rayed, and you see in its gut here, you see all these little stones. This is a fossil dinosaur here, and you see that in the skeleton where the stomach would be, unfortunately the soft parts are gone. They've rotted away. They're only the hard parts, the skeletons here. Where the stomach was, or where the gizzard was, I should say, you see all these rocks. And if you look at those rocks, they're very smooth. They've been shined because in the gut, these things are constantly smushing, grinding against each other. And again, that's the whole point of them, is to grind against the food, break it into smaller pieces. And as you're doing that, the rocks get shined. So a lot of modern animals have these. Now, not every shiny rock that you see, especially not around here, because we have a lot of glacier rocks that are quite well polished. Or if you go to the beach processes will polish the rocks like this too. Think about like beach glass, sea glass, how polished that is. Similar process, but this is actually happening in the gut of an organism. And so it's kind of hard to tell them apart and definitively say it's a gastrolith, unless it's like right here in the contents of the stomach, but pretty cool. So that's all we got for today. Hope you enjoyed that lesson, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.